Hey guys, welcome back to the fourth episode of this Web API design series. So in the last video, I talked about how modern day Web API security is implemented using OAuth. If you haven't watched that video yet, the link is down in the description below. Go check it out. In this video, I'm going to show you how to implement the OAuth Authorization Code Flow. Now, I'm not going to build my own authorization server, so I'm going to use Auth0 to do this for me. If you've never heard of it, it's basically a cloud identity provider that helps you focus on building web applications while they handle the authentication and authorization problems for you. Auth0 has got a ton of great libraries to help you implement OAuth for your application. But I won't be using them in this tutorial because they kind of do all the work for you, and it's much better to learn the entire flow by setting things up manually. So we'll be using their HTTP APIs directly to get things going. Once you learn how things are done manually, it becomes that much more easier to use their libraries. Alright, so let's have a look at what we're planning to build today. Okay, so the first thing is we're going to build an API. I'm going to call it the Challenges API. Now this is a protected API that a user needs an access token to access. Basically, this API has only one endpoint that's supposed to return some challenges data. The data itself doesn't really matter, but you need to have specific permissions to read data from this API. So who's going to consume it? Well, we're going to be building a dashboard, a frontend, and a backend to consume this data. Now, the reason we need a frontend and a backend is because we need both a front channel and a back channel to do the authorization code flow in a secure manner. So the dashboard frontend is responsible to get the user to log in and authorize, and Auth0 is going to give us back an authorization code. We are going to use that code, send it over to the dashboard backend, and the dashboard backend is going to use that and exchange it for an access token. Now, if the user has the right permissions, when we make a call with the access token to the Challenges API, the Challenges API verifies the token against Auth0, and then it also checks for the claims and the scopes and the permissions, all of that stuff inside the Challenges API. If all goes through successfully, it's going to return back the data and it's going to send it all the way back to the dashboard. And we're going to display the data in the dashboard. So we're going to do all this today. And if you're interested in learning how this is done, follow through with me. Okay, so now I'm in the Auth0 management dashboard. For you to get here, all you need to do is go and sign up for Auth0, create a free account, and you'll get here. Once you're here, make sure you're in the APIs tab. And when you're in the APIs tab, go ahead and click Create API. So what we're doing here is basically creating a registration for our API, the Challenges API. So let's go ahead and call this Challenges API. This is basically the name that we're going to use for this API. It's just metadata. This part is slightly more important. This is the identifier for your API. Now it doesn't have to be an actual publicly accessible URL. You can just type whatever you want in here. Let's call HTTPS www.challengesapi.com. That's it. So this becomes your identifier, which you'll need to pass along when you're making requests later on. Let's leave the signing algorithm as it is. Let's click Create. Okay, so now it's done creating our API for us. It's given us a quick start, which we'll start using in a bit. Switch it over to Node.js. But basically, let's jump into the Settings tab. Now, in the Settings tab, you can see that your identifier for this API is set. This is basically your audience parameter later on when you want to make requests. So over here, you have your token settings, your token expiration. This is a rather large expiration, but I'm just going to leave it as it is for this demo. Go back down and you'll see something called the RBAC settings. Now you want to enable RBAC settings and add permissions to your access token. This is because we want our access tokens to actually contain certain permissions, which we'll set up in a little bit. And basically that's it. You can click Save here. And let's jump in to the permissions section. So this is where you set up the scopes for your API. So you can have all kinds of scopes like read, write, and so on. They've given us an example here, read appointments. Now we have challenges, so let's call read challenges one as one. Let's give it a quick read your challenges. Let's add it in. And let's also add something called write challenges. Write your challenges. Alright, so now we got two permissions, or rather scopes, that this API can provide. And in this example, we're not actually going to use the write challenges, but I added in just so you could see what it looks like in the access token later on. So that's it. That's basically all you need to do to actually set up your API in Auth0. Pretty simple, right? Okay, so now let's jump back into the quick start. And if you go over to the Node.js section, they've given us some sample code. Now, this code already contains your configurations for this API. You can see we've set it up as challenges API, and it set it up as the audience for us. There's the issuer, the algorithm, and all of this. Basically, all you need to do is copy this stuff in, and we can actually jump into our VS Code and get started. Alright, so now I'm in my VS Code. We've just copied over that quick start guide, and let's paste it in. So let's have a look at what's actually going on here. So we have an Express application. We have a JWT Express package. We have a JWKS check that's going to be done. We are setting up a port at 8080. Yep, let's leave it at 8080. So we set up a check and we pass in the URI, which is our ambient coder, the API that we just set up. We're saying the audience is the challenges API. Yep, that's correct. And the issuer is ambient coder. So basically this is going to verify that whatever token comes our way, going to add it in as a middleware and verify that the token is from this issuer and for this audience and has this public secret. So that's cool. So that's just a JWT verification that works fine for us. But if you remember, we are actually interested in adding permissions checks as well. So let's see how we can add permissions checks. In order to do this, we need to use a package. I'm going to call it guard and require, and the package is Express JWT permissions. This makes it very easy to set up permissions and check them as a middleware. So this is our authorized endpoint. Let's quickly change that to challenges, as we know that's what it's going to be called. And let's actually change this up. We're going to send in some JSON and let's set up the JSON. So let's just call this challenge 1. This is the first challenge, and say challenge 2. This is another challenge. So basically, I'm not going to invest time in actually setting up all of this correctly. It's just some dummy data, so I've set it up. Let's now use our guard. So the way this works is actually the guard is a piece of middleware. So let's set it up. We actually do guard.check, and into the check goes an array. It's an array of all the scopes that you want to verify for this particular endpoint. Now this is a get call to the challenges endpoint. So I want to make sure that anyone who accesses this endpoint has the scope read challenges. That's exactly what we set up in the API. So let's make sure this has to be a string. So read challenges. There you go. It's as simple as that. And we are pretty much set up. So as you can see, I didn't actually install any of these packages because I had kind of pre-set up this application. But obviously you want to npm install all of these. All right, so let's see if our application is ready to run. Oops, it seems like we have an error. It says guard.check. Oh, yep, okay. I think I know what that is. This is a function, so let's see if that solves the problem. All right, seems like everything's running fine. So we've set up our API, it's running, it's ready to receive requests. Now let's move on to setting up the front-end application. All right, so now we're back in the Auth0 management dashboard and we're back in the APIs. So we already created our API, but now we need to set up our front-end application, or rather the consuming application. To do that, go over to your applications and click create application. So when you click create applications, you have a bunch of options here. Now you can choose whatever you want based on the kind of application that you're building. So this can be a native application, like something that's a mobile application or desktop application. You could also have a single page web application, which is what I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to select that. You could have regular web applications, machine-to-machine applications. So basically machine-to-machine is like servers or shell scripts and so on. You can pretty much decide whatever you want here. What I'm going to do for this example, like I said, is to select a single page web application. It's going to be a simple React application. So once I select that, it's going to give me a quick start. It's basically going to ask me, what are you planning to use to build this application? I'm going to say React, and it gives me a nice guide where, everything is in there for me. It goes through everything that I need to configure, and it even talks about the SDK, which I talked about at the very beginning of this video. So I'm not going to use that because that just simplifies everything, and it's a little difficult to get the entire flow when everything is just encapsulated by this Auth0 React SDK. So I'm not going to use that, but you can check this stuff out. So I've actually set up my application before, so I'm not going to do it again. Let's go back into applications and I'll show you the values that I've used for the dashboard app. So as you can see, I've called it dashboard app, and it gives me a domain for this, which is my ambient coder domain, and it's given me a client ID and a secret. Now these two are very important pieces of information that we'll need to use to get access tokens later on. Moving down, you have your application URIs. Now, because this is a test application that's running on my local host, I've used localhost in pretty much everything. So if your application is running through a DNS, you'd have to enter the correct DNS here. I don't have to do that because it's a local application, but it's important that you understand how these work. So the first thing is the allowed callback URLs. Basically, when you request an authorization code, you also have to state what your callback URL is. So you have to mention what exactly that's going to be, and if that's valid, then Auth0 will redirect back to this callback URL. So make sure that this is exactly the callback URL that you're going to set up for your front-end application. Then you can have your logout URL, your web origins, your allowed origins, and all of that. Now I've just set it to basically localhost 3000. So what this means is that I'm planning to build my front-end application and I'm going to run it on localhost 3000. That's the entry point to my front-end application. I'm going to set a callback URL. So I'm going to have a route in my front-end application that's called localhost 3000/challenges. This is where the redirect is going to happen to. I'll show you how that's done when we start coding the application. So that's basically it. That's all you need to do. And we are good to get started. So let's jump into the code. Okay, so now I'm in my VS Code to start coding the dashboard front end. So this is a React application that's supposed to be the front end, and it's going to have two routes, the default route and a challenges route, which is going to be the callback route that we just configured in Auth0. So I've already set up some skeletal code. Let's have a look at how things are structured in this application. So we've got our source folder, and in there, I've got my index.js to support front-end routing. I've got my browser router, got my app. I have some simple HTML. I have a login button component, a logout button component, and I've set up my challenges route, which again is my callback URL endpoint, and I have a challenges endpoint. So I've not really implemented any of these things. Let's quickly have a look at what's inside the login button. So the login button is very straightforward. It's just a button, and I have a login function that I have no implementation for, which we're going to start coding right now. And the logout button is also the same. There's no code in there. And we've also got the challenges. So the challenges component, once again, is just a simple HTML component. It has some content. So this is the data that we're going to get from our challenges API, and we're going to put it inside this h5 tag. So we have some work to do. Let's get started. So let's start with the login button. So the login button requires some data from the application that we just created. Now, the first piece of information is going to be the domain. This is the actual endpoint which holds the authorized endpoint. So if you remember, we have our domain set up as ambientcoder.us.auth0.com. This is essentially our domain. Let's copy that over, set it up here. That's our domain. We also need our audience. Well, our audience is actually our backend API, the challenges API that we just coded a while ago. So we created an ID for that. We just need to put that in here, which is https www.challengesapi.com. Then we need our scope. Well, for the challenges endpoint, we know that there are two scopes that are created, or rather two permissions that we're interested in. So for the permissions, let's just set it up as read challenges. We can also get OpenID to get an ID token and a few other things, but the focus here is just permissions. So I'm going to ignore all of that and focus only on the read challenges permission. So let's set that up. Next up, we need the client ID. So we set up the client ID. Let's go back into our application, copy over our client ID. There it is. So that's that. Then we have to define the response type. So the response type is the flow that you want to use in OAuth. We want to use the Authorization Code Flow. So we're going to say code over here. That's it. And then one last piece of information, which is the redirect URI. So the redirect URI is what's going to be called once we get the authorization code. What we want to do is actually get the application to redirect to this component. So in our app, we said we have a challenges route. So we want to get things moved to the challenges route. This front-end application is going to run on localhost 3000. So our challenges route will be in localhost 3000 as well. So set it up. Localhost 3000 and challenges. Keep in mind that the redirect URI that you define here has to match exactly what you set up as your allowed callback URL. There you go. That's the one. So this is the callback URL. This is all the information that we need to send the request over. So let's send the request over. Let's use fetch to do this. So let's set up fetch, and we are gonna use https:/domain. So the domain we just defined up there, let's use that. And along with the domain, we are gonna say we want to hit the authorize endpoint. Now, where is this endpoint coming from? If I go back into the application dashboard and I go all the way down and say show advanced settings, and when you go to endpoints, you can see under OAuth a few endpoints are defined here. So this is our authorized endpoint. This is where you send over your request in exchange for an authorization code under the authorization code flow. So this is where we're sending the request to. Now, along with that, we have to pass all this information as query parameters. So let's do that. All right, so one more thing we need to do. Because this is a front-end route, we need to say that the redirect should be done manually. This is an option with the fetch request that we can define. And once we do that, basically what happens is the redirect is not going to be automatically done. The problem with the redirect being automatically done is that the browser is going to make a request to this endpoint. Now this endpoint does not actually exist as a backend server. So this is going to be a 404. What we want to do is reroute it in the front-end application. So we can get the response and we can reroute it ourselves by setting it to manual. The way we do it is by going to Window, Location, and setting it as Replace, and we can get the response and take the URL. Now, when it hits this URL, which is our challenges endpoint, it's actually going to contain the authorization code. So it's going to look something like this, where it's going to be your code over there. So we need to pull out that code from the URL in the challenges component. So let's go and set up the challenges component right now. Okay, so in the challenges component, we know we're going to have to extract something from the URL. So the way we do this is by accepting the location, and then we want to pull out from the location a query parameter called code. So to pull out query parameters, we need to get query string. So query string from query string, here you go. This is an npm package that we can use, and we will use that. Extract the code, pass the location, search, and that should give us the code. So that's that. Now, what do we do with this code? So basically, we have to call our dashboard backend with this code because that's the service that's responsible for doing the exchange. So the front end has kind of done its job. It's got the user to log in, it's gotten the authorization code. Now let's take the code and hand it over. So let's implement that piece of code. So to do that, let's first get useState, because we want to get a response back from that API and we want to set it up in state. And also we want to run it as an effect. So let's get those two, and inside we can say constant challenge data. Let's call it challenges data, and say set challenges data, and say useState, and say, let's say none to begin with. Right, so now let's do our use effect so that we can make our fetch call to the backend. So fetch, and our backend server is basically gonna be HTTP localhost 3001. Now it can be anything, but I want to keep it as close to our front-end server, so it's just one port number away. So it's 3001. Keep in mind that our challenges API is running on 8080. Our front end is on 3000. Our backend for the dashboard is on 3001. Now we also want to call it challenges here. That's just basically what I want to call it, so that it makes it very clear that this endpoint is responsible for doing an exchange and retrieving challenges information from the external challenges API. So we do that, and we have to pass in the code. So say code. Now let's set up some request configurations. So the method, we know it's going to be a get. We also want to pass in some headers, and let's say content type is going to be application JSON, and we also want to accept application JSON. That's pretty much all we need to do for the configuration. It's not going to be an authenticated call, so that's pretty much it. Now we can start using our response. So we got a result. This result is going to be a JSON, so that's a promise. We do that, and then we do then again, and so then we can go challenge data, and we can set it as res. Well, actually it's going to be a JSON, so let's do JSON.stringify and let's do res. So that's going to be good enough for us. And one more thing is that we want this to run only if the code changes. If it doesn't, we don't really want it to run. So now we've got the data, let's add it in here. That's basically all our front end actually needs to do. Now, I didn't implement the logout button, so let's quickly do that as well. So the logout button is very simple. We have a domain, which we need again. And we also need our client ID. And we need something called return to. So return to is where it's gonna come back to, and it's gonna be the default. This is basically your logout URL, which we configured as the localhost 3000. So that's all the information we need there, and we can use this to make a request to log out. So let's do response fetch. This is gonna be an await. So fetch, and then we can call the endpoint, which is HTTPS, and again it's our domain followed by logout, and we pass in our client ID equals our client ID and our return to, which equals return to that we just configured. So that's basically it. And also again, we want the redirect to be manual, so we set it up like that. And once we have the response, we do window.location.place, and we say response.url. So that's basically how we log out actually. So we've kind of set up the entire front-end application. The user logs in, we send in this information. There's nothing sensitive here, so it's completely fine to run this in the front end, and it sends us a URL. We route it back in here, and in here we have the code, which is the authorization code. We take that and we send it to our secure channel, which is our backend. And then from the backend, it's responsible to do the exchange, get the data, send it back over to us. Once we get the data, we set it up as challenges data in our component. So if everything goes well, we should see things running fine. All right, so now let's start writing the dashboard backend code. We know the responsibility of this service is very simple. It needs to get an access token by exchanging the authorization code with the authorization server, and then using that access token, we need to make a call to the challenges endpoint, which is a protected route, the one we wrote at the very beginning. So let's see how we can do this. To speed things up a little bit, I've kind of come up with some skeletal code here. It's just some basic error handling, and we've already set up a request to the challenges endpoint. You can see that there's no authorization header in this request, so it's definitely going to fail. What we need to do is extract out the authorization code, do the exchange, and add the access token in here. So let's get started. Okay, so in order to do this, I want to first set up a middleware that's responsible for getting the request, extracting out the query parameters, and doing the exchange. So let's pull that out of this endpoint and set it up as a middleware. So let's say app.use, and let's call it OAuth. And obviously this doesn't exist, so let's create it. And in here, let's create a folder. Let's call it middleware. And in there, let's create Auth.js. So going back in here, let's set the reference. There you go. So that should work. Now let's start coding what goes inside this middleware. The first thing is this middleware needs to make some requests. So let's get Axios. I like to use Axios in my backend Node applications to make requests. So you'd obviously need to install this package in order to use it. Let's also set up our token endpoint. So the token endpoint can be extracted from your application settings in OAuth. Mine is gonna be this. There you go. That's my token endpoint. So let's set up a function. Now this is a middleware function. So we're gonna get a request object, we're gonna get a response, and the next callback. So set it up. Let's also not forget to export this. There you go. So the first thing we need to do is actually extract the query parameter. So let's do that by saying request.query.code. That's what we call it, code. So let's pick it up. And let's also say that if there is no code, then we are gonna send a status of 401. And let's say missing authorization code. So now that we have it, we need to make a request to the token endpoint. Now let's set up the information that the token endpoint needs from us. Now we're going to set this up as URL search parameters because this is going to be a form that we're going to post over to the token endpoint. So let's set it up. Whoops, URL search parameters, and we can do params.append. The first thing we're going to append is the grant type. Now the grant type is going to be authorization code. The second thing is going to be our client ID. So client ID, let's fill this in. Can go over and get our client ID, which is all the way up here. There you go, that's our client ID. And append, we are also gonna need our client secret. So this is the sensitive information that you really don't want running in your front end. Let's copy it over. Let's paste it in there as well. And we also need to add our code. So it's plain and simple code, put it in there. We also need a redirect URI over here. So redirect URI, and that's gonna be http://localhost 3000 challengers, which is the redirect URI that you set up in the first place. So this is good enough. Let's do axios.post to the token endpoint, and let's pass in the params. Then we get our callback. So that's our response. And what we are going to do with this response is we are going to set it to the request object so that the next piece of the function can actually make use of the response that we are attaching to the request. So we go request.OAuth equals response.data, and that's it. So anyone else who is along this request chain can actually use the OAuth, and we're going to call next, and that's it. So in case there is an error, we are going to say error, and let's log this as an error, and let's also send a status saying that it's forbidden. So let's say reason, and let's put in the reason is error.message. Change this real quickly. So basically what we are saying is we'll make a request to the token endpoint. If there is some kind of error, then it's most likely a 403. Now obviously this isn't what you should be doing. There could be different kinds of errors that are coming in, but for this example I'm going to assume that it's something to do with authorization. So I'm going to return a forbidden, and I'm going to put in the actual reason in there. So that's it. That's kind of what our middleware is supposed to do. So now let's start using this middleware in our original endpoint. Now let's get our access token. So it's called access token. So let's destructure it from the request, and we can now use this access token and set it as an authorization header. So we have headers, and we say authorization, and we say bearer, and we will give it our access token. So let's format this. Basically that's it. So our middleware is going to get us the access token. We will attach it to the endpoint, the call to our challenges API endpoint, and that's going to return some data, and we will send it back to the front end. If there is some kind of error, maybe you don't have the right authorization to access this information. If it's a 401, let's send a 401. If it's a 403, your permissions are probably denied. You don't have the right permissions. So let's send that over. Maybe something else went wrong. So let's indicate that it was an internal server error. And this is basically all you need to do to set this up. So now we've set up our front end. We've set up our backend for the dashboard application. We also set up our API. I think we're ready to try the entire flow out. So let's check out how that's going to work. Alright, so now we're in the dashboard. So this is basically what the front end looks like. We just have these two buttons that we coded out. Let's see what happens when I click login. Alright, so login was supposed to make a request to the authorize endpoint. The authorize endpoint actually opens up a login page for you. So this is done by Auth0 for you, and you don't have to do anything to set this up. So basically I don't have an account here, so I'm going to log in with a sign up. I'm going to say ambientcoder@gmail.com, and I'm going to give it a password. Let's give it a simple password. Alright, so now it's saying the dashboard app is requesting access to your Ambient Coder account. So Let's click accept. Okay, so now we're redirected, but we're saying a permission denied error. And that's not right, or is it? Well, I just logged in as a user, right? But what I didn't do was assign any permissions to this user. So let's go back into our Auth0 management dashboard. Let's look at our users. So you can see my user just logged in just a minute ago. And if I go into this user and I go into permissions, well, this user doesn't have any permissions. So it actually makes sense why our challenges API refused to accept this request. So let's assign some permissions and let's select challenges API. When you select the application, you can immediately see the scopes that are available. Let's give this user read and write challenges permissions. Click save, and there you go. Now let's go back in here. Let's log out. There you go, logs me out. Let's log back in. It's gonna ask me to log back in again. So I'm just gonna do this one more time. So this is pretty interesting. So this is the actual consent part where I, as the user, have to now consent to giving the dashboard application the right to read challenges. So once I consent to it, it's going to take me back to challenges with a code. Now, this code is used to make a request to the backend of the dashboard, which would have exchanged the token for an access token and sent it to the challenges API. That's why you can see the response coming all the way back from the challenges API. So let's do one more thing. Let's get rid of the read challenges one more time. Let's log out, log back in. Gonna have to type this again. And there you go, permission denied again. So just as we expected it. So basically, that's how you can implement the entire OAuth flow all by yourself. I hope this example clearly explained to you how the entire thing works. So if you go back into this diagram, we built the dashboard front end. We got the user to log in. You saw what a consent granting looks like. And then we got Auth0 to return back the authorization code, send it back to the backend. In the backend, we coded it to exchange it for an access token and then use that access token to make requests. And we saw that we successfully get the access token and send requests, but if this access token does not contain the right permissions, well, then you can't access the challenges API. So basically, I hope this makes things very clear for you, and I hope that this implementation gives you confidence to go out there and build your own applications and start using OAuth. And that's all I have for you for this video, guys. I hope you really enjoyed this video. I'd love to hear your comments, leave them down below. And if you enjoy this kind of content, please subscribe to my channel. So thanks for joining. Till next time.